Hey guys, tonight we're going to unroll the giant, slightly messy quilt that is American history. And yes, it has coffee stains, loose threads, and a few questionable design choices. Imagine lying back, closing your eyes, and letting centuries of stories drift past like clouds. Some stories will be dramatic, some tragic, and some so oddly specific you'll wonder, did that really happen? Spoiler, usually, yes. So if you're lying in bed right now, maybe hugging your pillow like it owes you rent, settle in. This will be long, meandering, and hopefully soothing. Before we dive in, hit like on this video. It tells the mysterious YouTube algorithm that history is in fact worth dozing off to. And if you're new here, subscribe for more bedtime journeys through the past. Oh, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you? And what time is it? I like to imagine someone in New York, listening at midnight, while someone else in Sydney is making breakfast, and wondering why I keep describing battles in my sleep voice. Now here's the thing. The United States didn't just pop into existence one July afternoon in 1776, like someone downloading a new app. No, this story stretches back thousands of years before any European ship poked its way across the Atlantic. Picture it, endless forests, thicker than your phone's update log, rivers so wide they felt like oceans, and skies without a single power line. To modernize, it might look empty, but it wasn't. It was already home to millions of people, with cities, farms, trade routes, and rituals that pulsed with life. And that's where our sleepy journey begins. You'll hear the shuffle of feet across colonial cobblestones, the groan of wagon wheels on muddy tracks, the whistle of steam trains, and eventually the static buzz of televisions and the glow of phone screens. But let's not rush. History will still be here when you wake up. For now, we'll walk slowly, like someone sneaking back into the kitchen at midnight for one last snack. So take a breath, get cozy, and let the centuries roll by. Our first stop, a continent already alive, long before Columbus ever got lost trying to reach Asia. Long before anyone thought to name this place America, the land was already humming with life. Not empty wilderness, not blank maps waiting to be colored. And this was a continent dense with stories, a patchwork of nations, languages, and traditions. When Europeans finally arrived, they liked to describe the land as untamed. Which is a bit like showing up late to a party, seeing half the guests already dancing, and announcing, "Ah yes, look at this empty room." Picture the Mississippi River around the year 1100. Instead of steamboats or jazz drifting from New Orleans, you'd see Cahokia, a sprawling city of earth and ceremony. At its peak, Cahokia may have housed 20,000 people, larger than London at the same time. Picture vast plazas buzzing with traders carrying copper from the Great Lakes, seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. Priests climbed the towering Monk's Mound in feathered cloaks, their voices rising in ritual above the city. The air would have been thick with the smoke of hearths, the scent of maize, beans, and squash. If you squint, you can almost hear the shuffle of feet, the beat of drums, the murmur of 1,000 conversations. And yet if you look at most school books, Cahokia gets about as much attention as a pop-up ad. And Cahokia wasn't some isolated marvel. Across the northeast woodlands, the Haudenosaunee, whom the French later called the Iroquois, were weaving a political alliance that was as stable as it was sophisticated. Their great league of peace brought together multiple nations under one council fire. Leaders debated until consensus was reached. Think about that. Centuries before the United States existed, there was already a system of federal governance functioning without written constitutions, enforced not by armies, but by tradition and trust. Some historians argue the framers of the U.S. Constitution borrowed elements of this structure though the founding fathers weren't exactly in the habit of footnoting native contributions. Either way, the Haudenosaunee had figured out how to live in unity while Europeans were still throwing chairs across parliaments. Travel southwest, and the landscape shifts to mesas and desert. Here lived the ancestral Puebloans, who built entire villages into cliffsides. Their homes etched into sandstone seemed to cling to the rock itself. Imagine climbing a ladder in the chill desert, night stars blazing overhead, to step into a kiva, a ceremonial chamber carved into the earth. Fires flickered on walls, painted with symbols, shadows dancing like spirits. Survival here required ingenuity. Irrigation canals drew life from meager rains. Crops were timed to the cycles of the sky. For these people, astronomy wasn't an academic exercise. It was a calendar for life and ceremony. Meanwhile, across the endless grasslands of the Great Plains, nations moved with the rhythm of the bison herds. Outsiders would later call this wandering, but it was anything but rootless. Every river, crossing every ridge and grove, had names, stories, meanings. Camps were mobile, yes, but bound together by memory and tradition. The pounding of hooves wasn't random chaos. It was order as steady as a drumbeat. Imagine lying in tall grass and feeling the ground tremble as thousands of bison thunder passed, while families set up teepees. In the distance, fires glowing against the dusk. Knowledge wasn't preserved in books. It was sung in stories painted on hides and whispered by elders. And because of that, it was alive, not locked away. On the far western coast, the forests rose like cathedrals of cedar, and here the peoples of the Pacific Northwest turned trees into canoes, longhouses, and towering totem poles. These poles weren't decoration. They were memory carved in wood, preserving lineages, myths, and lessons. Walking through such a village, you'd see smoke rising from massive plank houses, salmon roasting on open fires, and poles standing sentinel in the mist. Each one a vertical library of family and history. If you stitch all this together, Cahokia's mounds, Haudenosaunee council fires, Pueblo Cliff dwellings, plains camps, and cedar villages, you see something that looks nothing like untamed wilderness. Historians now estimate that as many as 50 million people lived in the Americas before European contact. That's roughly the population of Europe at the same time. 50 million people farming, hunting, building, trading, and governing themselves. And yet, in the stories, most of us grew up with, this entire world gets reduced to a line or two before Columbus sails in to discover it. Of course, mystery lingers. Cahokia itself, for instance, began to decline long before Europeans ever arrived. By the 1300s, the plazas were empty, the mounds silent. Why theories range from climate change to deforestation, political strife to shifting trade routes. The truth remains uncertain, buried beneath centuries of soil. Today, those mounds sit under blankets of grass. Drivers pass by on the interstate without realizing they're skimming past the remains of a once great city. It's as if New York vanished, and a few hundred years later, someone looked at a grassy hill and thought, nice place for a picnic. That silence is haunting. But it isn't the silence of emptiness. It's the silence of memory, like the pause after a song ends, but still echoes in your head. Much of history is like that, not battles and speeches, but the quiet disappearance of entire ways of life, leaving only fragments for us to piece together. Pottery shards, pollen in the soil, petroglyphs on stone walls. These are the whispers that remain, and it's worth remembering that native history didn't vanish. The descendants of these cultures still exist today. Haudenosaunee, Pueblo, Lakota, Hopi, Navajo, Cherokee, and many more. Their languages are still spoken, their ceremonies still held, their stories still alive. The idea that America began with a European landing is just that, an idea. The reality is far older, far richer. So as you lie in your room tonight, maybe listening to the hum of a fan, the tick of a clock, try imagining another silence. The hush before dawn in a forest where drums once echoed. The midnight stillness over a mound city, stars bright overhead, fires burned low. Or the soft rush of wind across a cliff, dwelling the desert cool against stone. Those silences weren't empty. They were full of lives, full of stories. And in some way, if we listen closely, they still are. By the late 1400s, whispers of far-off lands and untold riches were floating across Europe like the medieval version of clickbait. Sailors told stories of golden cities, spices worth their weight in castles, and shortcuts to Asia that nobody could quite prove existed. And into this brew of rumor and ambition stepped Christopher Columbus, an Italian with questionable math skills, an iron will, and the kind of optimism you only see in people who haven't read the fine print. Now here's the thing. Columbus didn't discover America. You can't discover a continent already home to millions of people, with cities, trade routes, and stories stretching back thousands of years. That's like walking into a crowded restaurant, sitting at someone else's table, and declaring, "I found this place." Still, in 1492, Columbus sailed west with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, hoping to reach Asia. Instead, he landed in the Bahamas, greeted by people who must have been very polite, considering a stranger had just shown up on their beach announcing he owned the place. It wasn't the first time outsiders had crossed the Atlantic. Centuries earlier, Norse explorers had reached North America, setting up a short-lived settlement in what we now call Newfoundland. They built homes, fought with local peoples, then packed up and left, perhaps realizing the winters were long and the neighbors not too keen on uninvited guests. By the time Columbus set sail, their story was half forgotten, tucked away in sagas nobody in Spain was reading. Columbus's arrival sparked what historians call the Age of Discovery, though the people already living here might have called it the Age of Intrusion. Spain rushed to stake claim, sending conquistadors armed with steel horses and a baffling sense of entitlement. Hernán Cortés marched into Mexico, toppling the Aztec Empire with a mix of alliances, gunpowder, and diseases that spread faster than any army. Francisco Pizarro did the same to the Inca in Peru. These encounters weren't just battles, they were collisions of worlds. Imagine it, the first sight of armored men on horseback, gleaming weapons reflecting the sun. To the indigenous peoples, it must have seemed as if monsters had walked out of myth. And yet the conquerors weren't invincible. They were vastly outnumbered, often on the brink of failure. It was disease, smallpox, measles, influenza that cut deepest sweeping through communities that had never known such plagues. Populations collapsed, cities emptied, and the balance of power tilted almost overnight. The newcomers saw opportunity everywhere. Gold and silver poured from the Americas into Spanish coffers, fueling empires and wars back in Europe. Sugar plantations spread across the Caribbean, worked by enslaved Africans, dragged across the ocean in brutal voyages that reshaped entire continents. The so-called discovery was less about new lands and more about new systems of exploitation, trade, slavery, and empire bound together. And yet, there was wonder too. Strange new foods crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Imagine Europe before potatoes, tomatoes, or chocolate, basically a world without French fries, pizza, or hot cocoa. The Columbian Exchange reshaped diets everywhere. Corn-fed populations in Africa and China. Coffee and sugar fueled global cravings. Tobacco became a craze, puffed in courts and taverns alike. If you've ever enjoyed a slice of pizza with tomato sauce, you can thank this messy, often violent exchange of plants and ideas. But let's not forget the people at the center of this storm, indigenous nations facing upheaval on a scale hard to imagine. For some, the arrival of Europeans was bewildering. For others, it was a nightmare. Alliances were forged. Wars erupted, old enemies used new weapons to settle scores. And all the while, missionaries followed conquistadors carrying crosses and sermons determined to reshape souls as well as lands. By the early 1600s, the Spanish had carved out a sprawling empire stretching from the Caribbean to South America and parts of North America. Other European powers took notice. England, France, and the Netherlands all decided they wanted in on the action. The New World was no longer just a rumor, it was a prize, and everyone wanted a piece. So when Columbus planted his flag in 1492, he wasn't opening a new chapter so much as tearing into a very old book and scribbling his own name on the margins. His voyages were the spark that lit centuries of colonization, conflict, and transformation. And while history books sometimes dress it up as a grand adventure for millions of people already here, it was the beginning of a storm that would change everything. Tonight, though, as you're lying in the quiet, it's worth imagining that first encounter, not from the deck of Columbus's ship, but from the shore. Imagine watching strange sails appear on the horizon, growing larger each hour until unfamiliar men stepped onto the beach, planting flags and crossing themselves. The world you knew was about to tilt, and there was no way to tilt it back. By the early 1600s, Europe had gotten a taste of the New World, and like someone who's had their first French fry, they weren't going back. Spain already had its empire humming, but now England, France, and the Netherlands were itching to plant flags of their own. The Atlantic became less a terrifying abyss and more of a very bumpy commuter route. Ships crossed constantly, carrying settlers, soldiers, merchants, and let's be honest, a fair share of dreamers who thought they'd strike it rich and instead struck malaria. The English were among the first to test their luck. In 1607, they founded Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement. Permanent might be a bit generous, considering that within a year, most of the colonists had either starved, gotten sick, or learned that you can't eat gold. The survivors hung on thanks to the leadership of Captain John Smith, and more crucially, the agricultural knowledge of local Powhatan peoples. Of course, relations were rocky. One moment, the two sides traded corn. The next, they were at war. The romanticized story of Pocahontas smoothing tensions is less Disney fairy tale and more complicated political chess, but it became part of America's founding mythology anyway. Further north, in 1620, the Mayflower carried a group of religious separatists we now call the Pilgrims. They landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts, where they set up a small colony after a winter so brutal it makes modern camping trips look like luxury spa days. Half of them died that first year, but the survivors established traditions of self-rule. Their Mayflower Compact, signed before they even left the ship, was essentially a "we promise not to fall apart" document. It was basic, but it laid down early seeds of self-government, and when the next harvest finally came, they celebrated with a feast alongside Wampanoag allies, a moment later retold as the first Thanksgiving, though the reality was far less picture-perfect than the holiday version with cranberry sauce. Through the 1600s and 1700s, England planted colonies up and down the Atlantic coast, from the tobacco fields of Virginia to the bustling harbors of Boston and New York. Each colony had its own personality. Virginia thrived on tobacco, so much so that colonists sometimes used it as currency. New England leaned on fishing shipbuilding, and a hearty dose of Puritan discipline. Imagine being fined for skipping church, which sounds extreme until you remember that Netflix wasn't around to tempt them. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, became a haven for Quakers and other religious minorities while Georgia started as a kind of social experiment for debtors. Life in these colonies wasn't easy. Winters were brutal, harvests uncertain, and survival meant a lot of backbreaking labor. Imagine waking up in a drafty wooden cabin, your breath fogging the air, then trudging outside to tend fields or chop wood. You'd hear the creak of wagons, the clatter of blacksmiths, the gossip of neighbors in crowded town squares. Communities formed around churches, taverns, and markets, and slowly a sense of American identity, different from the old countries, began to emerge. But beneath the growing prosperity lurked deep tensions. Colonists relied heavily on enslaved Africans whose forced labor fueled the tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations of the South. By the mid-1700s, slavery was deeply woven into colonial life, shaping not only the economy, but also the harsh social divisions that would haunt America for centuries. At the same time, indigenous nations across the continent faced relentless pressure as colonists expanded. Treaties were made, and broken lands seized, and conflicts erupted. What settlers called progress was often survival at someone else's expense. And yet the colonies grew. Immigration swelled towns with people from across Europe. Streets rang with English, Dutch, German, French, and countless accents, a noisy mix that shaped everything from architecture to cuisine. If you had strolled through Philadelphia in the 1700s, you might have heard Quakers debating politics, smelled bread from German bakeries, and dodged pigs wandering the streets. Yes, pigs' urban animal control wasn't quite a thing yet. By the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies were thriving, but they were also restless. They had their own assemblies, their own ways of doing things, and a growing sense that they weren't just extensions of England. For now, they remained loyal to the crown. But in the taverns and town halls, the question simmered quietly, like a pot left too long on the fire. How long could they keep building their own world, while still answering to a king an ocean away? By the mid-1700s, life in the 13 colonies looked steady on the surface fields of tobacco and wheat waving in the wind, harbors crowded with ships, taverns buzzing with gossip sermons echoing from clapboard churches. But under all that, the ground was rumbling. The colonies were like teenagers who had grown too tall for their old clothes, still technically under the authority of the British Crown, but restless, opinionated, and increasingly convinced they deserved more say in their own lives. Britain, of course, disagreed, and nothing sparks family drama, like one side wanting independence while the other keeps sending bills. The first spark came with the French and Indian War, which ran from 1754 to 1763. Picture it, Britain and France squabbling over territory in North America, dragging their native allies and colonial subjects into the fight. For the colonists, it was messy, bloody, and expensive. When the dust finally settled, Britain technically won, but the victory came with a price tag so large, even London blinked. And guess who they decided should help pay the colonies? Nothing says thank you for fighting alongside us, like a stack of new taxes. The Stamp Act of 1765 was one of the first big ones. Suddenly, colonists had to pay extra for paper goods, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. Imagine sitting down for a friendly card game and realizing the king got a cut every time you shuffled. The colonists were not amused. They protested, rioted, and sometimes got creative mock funerals for liberty effigies of tax collectors hanging from trees. A particularly rowdy group in Boston called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Their main hobbies included making fiery speeches and ensuring tax collectors had the worst job security in the Western Hemisphere. Next came the Townshend Acts, which taxed imported goods like glass, paint, and tea. Colonists responded with boycotts, refusing to buy British goods. In today's terms, it was the 18th century version of unsubscribing. But the more the colonies pushed back, the more Britain doubled down. Tensions boiled in 1770 when British soldiers and colonists clashed in the streets of Boston. Snowballs, rocks, and angry words flew until shots rang out. 5 colonists lay dead. The event became known as the Boston Massacre, though if you asked the soldiers, they'd probably have called it that day. Everyone lost their temper. Either way, it was propaganda gold for the revolutionaries. Paul Revere's famous engraving depicted the soldiers firing in cold blood, fueling outrage across the colonies. And then there was tea. Ah, tea, the beverage that launched a revolution. Britain had slapped a tax on it, and colonists weren't having it. In December 1773, a group of Bostonians dressed as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in the harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. That's right, millions of cups gone. Fish in Boston Harbor probably swam around wired on caffeine for weeks. The protest became known as the Boston Tea Party, and it sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. Britain's response was swift and severe. They passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, shutting down Boston Harbor, revoking Massachusetts' charter, and basically treating the entire colony like a misbehaving child. Other colonies took notice. What happened to Boston today could happen to them tomorrow. For the first time, scattered colonies began to think of themselves as one people with a common cause. Behind the scenes, ordinary lives were being pulled into extraordinary events. Imagine a shopkeeper in Philadelphia suddenly pressured to stop importing British goods. Or a farmer in Virginia torn between loyalty to the crown and whispers of rebellion. For enslaved people, the turmoil raised unsettling questions. If the colonists shouted so loudly about liberty, why didn't it apply to everyone? For native nations, it was another storm to navigate weighing alliances and survival in a landscape where European powers fought over land that had never belonged to them in the first place. The First Continental Congress met in 1774, bringing delegates from 12 colonies together in Philadelphia. Picture the scene. Whigs' powdered tempers, short accents clashing. Some argued for reconciliation with Britain. Others hinted at independence. But one thing was clear: unity was no longer optional. The colonies began coordinating boycotts. Militias drilled in village greens, and everywhere the tension tightened like a bowstring. If you strolled through a colonial town in those years, you'd feel it in the air. Broadsheets plastered on tavern walls, debates spilling out of churches, whispers in markets. Children played games in the street, while their parents argued about rights and taxes. Everyone sensed something was coming. And here's the strange thing: not everyone wanted revolution. Many colonists, loyalists, remained faithful to Britain, believing rebellion would lead only to chaos. Families were divided, friendships strained. It was less like a clean break and more like an awkward Thanksgiving dinner, where half the table cheers for independence and the other half insists, "God save the king." Still, the tide was turning. The idea that a people could govern themselves free from monarchy, free from distant rulers, was spreading like wildfire. It wasn't just about taxes anymore. It was about identity. Were the colonists still British subjects? Or had they become something new? That question burned in taverns and town squares, and in the restless hearts of people who sensed history was about to change. And as 1775 dawned, the bowstring finally snapped. Skirmishes erupted in Massachusetts, and the colonies found themselves at war with their own mother country. What had started as arguments over stamps and tea had grown into a full-blown revolution. The stage was set, and the world would never be the same. Tonight, though, as you lie in the quiet, it's worth imagining the tension of those days. Imagine standing on a cobblestone street, hearing the distant drum of militia practice, smelling the salt air in Boston Harbor, still tinged faintly with tea. The world around you felt familiar, But something electric was in the air, an energy so sharp it kept people awake at night, even without coffee. A storm was coming, and everyone knew it. The year was 1775, and the colonies had finally run out of patience. What began as boycotts and petitions was now slipping into gunfire and smoke. On April 19th, in the quiet towns of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, the shot heard round the world cracked through the morning air. Nobody knew which side fired first, but within minutes, militiamen and British redcoats were trading volleys. Farmers dropped plows to grab muskets, and British soldiers, who had expected a tidy confiscation of weapons, found themselves retreating under fire. America's revolution had begun not with a grand declaration, but with panicked shouting, musket smoke, and the smell of trampled grass. At first, the idea of war with Britain seemed impossible. This was the mightiest empire on earth, with ships, armies, and resources beyond anything the colonies could dream of. Most Americans didn't even want independence, at least not yet. They wanted respect, fair treatment, maybe a little breathing room. But war has a way of clarifying things. By the summer of 1776, after months of bloodshed and King George III's refusal to compromise, delegates gathered in Philadelphia and took the leap. In a hot, fly-ridden room, Thomas Jefferson drafted words that would echo through centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Of course, all men didn't quite mean all men. Women enslaved, Africans, and native peoples were left conveniently out of the fine print. But the Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4th, was a radical statement. The colonies were no longer colonies. They were states united in defiance. Imagine signing your name to that parchment, knowing it made you a traitor, punishable by death. That's commitment, or at least really bad handwriting that the king couldn't identify. The war that followed was brutal, chaotic, and often teetered on the edge of disaster. George Washington, appointed commander of the Continental Army, faced an impossible task. His soldiers were underfed, underpaid, and undertrained, often marching without shoes or gunpowder. At Valley Forge during the winter of 1777-78, men shivered in ragged tents, surviving on thin gruel and hope. Disease stalked the camp, and morale sagged. Washington rode among them, a tall, somber figure, trying to hold an army together with sheer willpower. If leadership could be measured in patience, Washington was a giant. And yet, against all odds, the rebels scored victories that kept the dream alive. At Trenton, in 1776, Washington led a daring Christmas night crossing of the icy Delaware River, surprising Hessian mercenaries who had been celebrating a little too hard. The victory was small, but it electrified the colony's proof that the cause wasn't hopeless. Later at Saratoga, in 1777, American forces defeated a British army, convincing France to join the war. Suddenly, the colonists weren't alone. They had a powerful ally with ship's money and a deep grudge against Britain. Life on the home front was just as demanding. Women ran farms, businesses, and even followed the army to cook, nurse, and carry water. Figures like Deborah Sampson disguised themselves as men to fight, while others, like Molly Pitcher, became legends by taking up cannon fire when their husbands fell. Enslaved Africans faced impossible choices: fight for the British, who promised freedom, or fight for Americans, who mostly did not. Thousands seized the chance to escape bondage, amid the chaos, reshaping their own destinies. Meanwhile, native nations were caught in the crossfire. Some allied with the British, hoping to stem colonial expansion. Others sided with the Americans, calculating different risks. Either way, the war tore through their lands and lives. For them, independence often meant more encroachment, more broken promises. The fighting dragged on, moving from the northern colonies to the south. Battles were fierce, supplies scarce, and desertion common. Washington lost far more fights than he won, but he never surrendered. His genius wasn't in battlefield brilliance, it was in endurance. He kept the army alive long enough for circumstances to shift, and shift they did. By 1781, the war climaxed at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington and French General Rochambeau trapped British General Cornwallis's army, while the French Navy sealed off escape by sea. Surrounded and outnumbered, Cornwallis surrendered. The news rippled through the colonies. After 6 grinding years, independence was more than a dream. It was reality. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Britain formally recognized the United States of America. 13 colonies had become 13 states united in name, if not always in practice. Fireworks and parades didn't erupt overnight, mostly because fireworks were expensive and people were exhausted, but the sense of victory was unmistakable. Against the odds, a ragtag army and a collection of stubborn farmers, merchants, and thinkers had defeated an empire. But independence was only half the battle. Winning freedom is one thing. Figuring out what to do with it is another. The revolution left behind contradictions too glaring to ignore. A nation built on liberty still held hundreds of thousands in slavery. Women who had carried households and helped in the war were told politely to step back. Native peoples, who had fought on both sides, saw their lands carved up by treaties they never signed. The young republic had been born, yes, but it was already carrying heavy debts, not just financial, but moral. Still, for that moment, there was celebration. Imagine being in Philadelphia when the news arrived. Bells ringing, people crowding streets, flags waving, children shouting, taverns overflowing, strangers hugging each other in joy. For ordinary colonists who had endured shortages, cold winters, and years of uncertainty, independence felt like stepping into sunlight after a long night. And yet, in that same moment, someone had to ask the question, what now? 13 states, each with its own quirks and ambitions, would need to find a way to stay united. The war had ended, but the experiment of self-government was only beginning. So tonight, as you lie back, imagine the last flickers of campfires in a victorious army's camp. The muskets stacked, the uniforms tattered, the soldiers dreaming of going home. Imagine Washington, quiet and dignified, already thinking not about glory, but about how fragile this new nation truly was. The revolution was over, but the real struggle, the building of a country, was just beginning. The war was over, the British were gone, and the 13 states found themselves staring at one another like housemates who just threw a wild party and realized no one had thought about cleaning up. Independence had been one hooray, but now came the harder part, figuring out how to run an actual country. After all, it's one thing to shout, "No kings," in unison. It's another to decide who collects taxes, who commands armies, and most importantly, who gets the last slice of political power pie. The first attempt at a national framework came with the Articles of Confederation ratified in 1781. On paper, it looked like a government. In practice, it was more like a group chat where everyone ignored the admin. Congress could declare war-sign treaties and print money, but it couldn't enforce taxes or regulate trade. States were basically independent kingdoms, and some acted like it. Rhode Island, for instance, vetoed reforms so consistently that it earned the colonial equivalent of a bad Yelp review. Imagine trying to pay off war debts when every state insisted on doing its own thing, issuing different currencies, slapping tariffs on neighbors, and generally acting like teenagers testing curfew. The weaknesses became painfully clear during the 1780s. Soldiers who had fought in the Revolution often went unpaid. Farmers struggled with debt, and rebellions broke out, most famously Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. where farmers armed with pitchforks and anger shut down courts to protest foreclosures. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but it scared the political elite half to death. If angry farmers could shake the system this badly, what would stop another rebellion? Or worse, a collapse into chaos? Clearly, something stronger than the Articles was needed. So, in 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for what was supposed to be a modest meeting to tweak the Articles. Instead, they threw the whole thing out and wrote a brand new constitution. Picture the scene: men in powdered wigs and wool coats sweating through a Philadelphia summer, debating everything from representation to slavery. The air was thick with arguments, and probably with the smell of horses tied outside. Some delegates feared a strong central government would trample liberty. Others worried that a weak government would invite collapse. Out of this tug of war came a compromise: 3 branches of government checks and balances, and a federal system that gave both states and the national government important powers. And then there was the most uncomfortable compromise of all: slavery. Southern states wanted to count enslaved people as part of their population for representation in Congress, even though those same people had no rights. Northern delegates pushed back. The eventual solution, the infamous 3/5 compromise, counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person. It was a grim piece of math, a reminder that the nation's lofty ideals were already weighed down by contradiction. Still, the Constitution was signed, and in 1789, the United States officially launched its new government with George Washington as its first president. Washington wasn't eager for the job. He longed to retire to his estate at Mount Vernon, but his reputation for honesty and steadiness made him the obvious choice. He took office in New York City, which was the capital at the time, standing solemnly on a balcony, while crowds cheered below. There were no fireworks, no confetti, just a sense of nervous excitement. Could this experiment actually work? Washington set important precedents. He formed a cabinet, bringing in Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. The two immediately clashed because apparently America can't go 5 minutes without a political argument. Hamilton wanted a strong federal government with a national bank and industry at its core. Jefferson envisioned a republic of independent farmers wary of centralized power. Their rivalry gave birth to the first political parties, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. Yes, the ink on the Constitution was barely dry before Americans split into factions. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens were adjusting to this new reality. Farmers in western Pennsylvania protested a federal tax on whiskey in 1794 by staging what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. They insisted the tax was unfair, targeting rural folk who relied on whiskey as currency as much as drink. Washington responded by personally leading troops to put down the rebellion, the first and last time a sitting president has marched at the head of an army. The message was clear. The new federal government wasn't just ink on parchment. It had teeth. Foreign affairs added even more drama. In 1793, France erupted in revolution, and Americans were divided over whether to support their former ally. Hamiltonians leaned toward Britain for trade, while Jeffersonians sympathized with revolutionary France. Washington, ever cautious, steered a middle path, declaring neutrality. He also signed Jay's Treaty with Britain, averting another war, but angering many who felt it conceded too much. By the time he left office, after 2 terms, a precedent that would last until Franklin D. Roosevelt Washington was tired, wary, and deeply concerned about partisanship. In his farewell address, he warned against political factions and foreign entanglements. The irony, of course, is that Americans promptly ignored both warnings. After Washington came John Adams, the prickly New Englander who found himself dealing with near war against France in the so-called quasi-war. His presidency was marred by the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, which limited free speech and targeted immigrants. Critics saw it as a betrayal of the revolution's principles, and Adams's popularity sank. But in one of history's quieter miracles, the bitter election of 1800 saw power peacefully transfer from Adams to his rival Thomas Jefferson. The world took notice a republic could change leaders not by bloodshed, but by ballots. The early republic was fragile, but it endured. Cities bustled with commerce, newspapers flourished, often slandering opponents with glee, and a sense of American identity began to solidify. Farmers pushed west, merchants looked outward, and immigrants kept arriving, drawn by promises of opportunity. For all its flaws, its contradictions on liberty, its fierce divisions, the new nation was finding its footing. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet, imagine the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones, the glow of lanterns in Philadelphia, the murmur of debates drifting from halls thick with pipe smoke. Imagine Washington's steady gaze as he laid down power, a gesture so rare in history it felt almost revolutionary in itself. The United States was still fragile, still untested, but the foundations had been laid, however imperfect, and the House of the Republic had begun to rise. By the dawn of the 19th century, America was still a fragile young republic, awkward, argumentative, and not entirely sure of its own reflection in the mirror. But if there was one thing the nation shared, it was the irresistible urge to stretch. Westward lay millions of acres of forests, rivers, mountains, and plains. To European Americans, this land looked like a blank canvas. To native nations, it was home sacred and lived in. And to ambitious politicians in Washington, it was an opportunity too good to pass up. The single biggest leap came in 1803, when President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. Napoleon, busy with wars in Europe and increasingly tired of managing colonies an ocean away, sold it for $15 million a bargain, so staggering that even Jefferson, usually careful with money, couldn't resist. Overnight, the United States doubled in size. Maps were hurriedly redrawn, and Americans stared at the vast blank space labeled Louisiana with both excitement and confusion. What was actually out there? Mountains, rivers, dinosaurs. Okay, not dinosaurs, but in an age before Google Earth. Who knew? To find out, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on a daring expedition. Setting out in 1804, with a crew of about 40 men, they pushed up the Missouri River into territory few Americans had ever seen. They mapped rivers, documented plants and animals, and crucially relied on the guidance of native peoples. The most famous helper was Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, who, carrying her infant son, acted as interpreter and guide. Imagine the sight, a baby riding calmly on his mother's back, while the men around him staggered under heavy packs. Talk about multitasking. The expedition took over 2 years and covered thousands of miles all the way to the Pacific Ocean. When they finally returned, the journals they brought back were stuffed with descriptions of grizzly bears, towering mountains, and endless plains. It fired the imagination of the nation. If the revolution had been about liberty, this was about possibility, a sense that America's future stretched endlessly westward. But possibility for some meant dispossession for others. Native nations had lived across this land for centuries, shaping it with fire farming and migration. To them, westward expansion was not a romantic adventure, but an encroaching storm. Treaties were made often under pressure and just as often broken. Tribes faced displacement, disease, and conflict as settlers poured into new territories. For every wagon wheel creaking westward, there was a family forced from ancestral ground. The phrase, manifest destiny, would come later, but the idea that Americans had a divine right to expand was already taking root. On the ground, life on the frontier was rough. Imagine a family bumping along in a creaky wagon, oxen plodding children, complaining pots, clanging with every rut in the road. Nights were spent under the stars, listening to coyotes howl, while days were filled with chopping wood, building cabins, and trying to coax crops from stubborn soil. Frontier life meant endless labor, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of illness or isolation. And yet for many, it was freedom, the chance to carve out land and a life of their own. Cities grew too. Along rivers and trade routes, new towns sprang up buzzing with markets, blacksmiths, and the constant hammering of construction. The Mississippi River became the nation's main highway, carrying goods south to New Orleans. Flatboats piled with furs, wheat, and whiskey floated downstream, while steamboats soon churned back upstream, with smoke and paddle wheels transforming commerce overnight. For the first time, distant regions began to feel connected, bound together by trade and ambition. Politically, expansion stirred heated debates. Should new territories allow slavery or not? Each new state threatened to tip the balance in Congress between free states and slave states. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was one uneasy answer, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while banning slavery north of a certain line. It was a band-aid solution to a wound that kept reopening, but for the moment, it held the Union together. Meanwhile, the culture of the young nation was changing. Painters, writers, and travelers romanticized the frontier as a place of rugged independence. Think of leather-clad pioneers, rifles over shoulders, gazing nobly across endless plains. Reality was often less glamorous mud mosquitoes and back-breaking work, but the myth took hold. America, people began to say, was destined to spread from ocean to ocean, but that destiny came with costs. As settlers pushed west, clashes with native nations grew fiercer. The War of 1812, fought partly over British support for native resistance, highlighted the stakes. Leaders like Tecumseh tried to forge powerful confederacies to resist American expansion, dreaming of a united native front. Their courage was immense, but the tide of population and power pressed relentlessly westward. By the 1830s, forced removals like the Trail of Tears would reveal just how devastating that tide could be. And yet, in this early era, the mood in many towns and farms was one of energy and optimism. Imagine standing on the edge of a newly settled field, gazing westward at a horizon that seemed infinite. Imagine hearing stories of rich soil, tall forests, and rivers filled with fish. For families crowded in older towns, the frontier offered space elbow room, as one writer called it, and the promise of a fresh start. For enslaved Africans in the South, however, expansion often meant harsher realities. Cotton, powered by the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, spread rapidly across new lands, and with it, the demand for enslaved labor. For many, the horizon that symbolized freedom for white settlers symbolized chains that stretched ever farther. The contradiction was glaring, a nation built on liberty expanding through bondage. By the 1820s, the United States had grown dramatically, its people spilling across mountains and rivers into lands that had once seemed unimaginably distant. The Revolution had secured independence, but this restless push westward was shaping America's identity just as powerfully. A republic of farmers and merchants was becoming a continental nation, one cabin, one wagon, one treaty at a time. Tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow, picture the creak of wagon wheels, the hiss of a steamboat, the whisper of prairie grasses bending under wind. Imagine campfires glowing on the edge of vast forests, children falling asleep to the murmur of stories about what lay ahead. Expansion was messy, costly, and often unjust, but it was also a dream that pulled the young nation forward, step by uncertain step, into a future as wide as the horizon. By the mid-1800s, the young republic had stretched itself from coast to coast, but the further it expanded, the more it tugged at the seams holding it together. For decades, Americans had been pushing westward, planting towns, railroads, and farms. But every new patch of land brought the same burning question: would slavery be allowed there or not? It was a question that turned neighbors into enemies and drew a bright, jagged line across the nation's heart. Slavery had been America's contradiction since birth. The Declaration of Independence had promised liberty and equality, but in the same breath, the new republic had allowed millions of people to remain enslaved. By 1850, the United States was home to nearly 4 million enslaved men, women and children, the vast majority laboring on southern plantations. Cotton was king, and the cotton boom poured wealth into the South and filled the holds of ships that sailed to England's mills. But that wealth came at the price of human misery, families torn apart, bodies, broken lives owned. In the North, slavery was increasingly condemned. Abolitionists raised their voices in newspapers, pamphlets, and fiery speeches. Figures like Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave turned brilliant orator, and Harriet Tubman, who risked her life again and again guiding people to freedom along the Underground Railroad, became symbols of defiance and hope. Meanwhile, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, spread like wildfire in the 1850s, giving many Northerners their first vivid look at slavery's brutal reality. Abraham Lincoln later joked half-seriously that Stowe's book started the war. The South, however, dug in its heels. Leaders argued that slavery was not only an economic necessity, but a way of life, even a positive good. Plantations symbolized wealth and order, while enslaved labor kept the system humming. Any threat to slavery, Southerners insisted, was a threat to their very survival. Tension deepened with every compromise and crisis. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had been an early attempt to maintain balance. Missouri entered as a slave state, Maine as free, and a line was drawn across the map. North of it, slavery was banned. South of it, permitted. But as the nation grew, the line blurred. The Mexican-American War in the 1840s added vast new territories, and once again the debate flared: would these lands be slave or free? In 1850, Congress tried another patchwork fix with the Compromise of 1850. California entered as a free state, but in exchange the South got the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners to return escaped slaves. The law outraged many in the North, who suddenly found themselves forced into complicity with slavery. Tensions grew sharper. Imagine being a free black family in the North, watching over your shoulder, fearing that kidnappers could drag you south under the cover of law. Then came Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 let settlers decide for themselves whether slavery would be allowed. The result? Chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into Kansas armed and angry. Towns were burned, people were killed, and the territory earned the grim nickname Bleeding Kansas. It was a dress rehearsal for the violence to come, a miniature civil war before the real one erupted. The national political scene fared no better. New parties rose and fell, split apart, and reformed all around the slavery question. The Republican Party was born in the 1850s, with a firm stance against the expansion of slavery. Among its rising stars was a lanky lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, whose debates with Senator Stephen Douglas made him a household name. Lincoln argued that the nation could not endure half slave and half free. Douglas insisted on popular sovereignty, let the people of each territory decide. But by then, the people deciding often carried rifles. The Supreme Court poured gasoline on the fire in 1857 with the Dred Scott decision. Scott, an enslaved man, had sued for his freedom after living in free territory. The court not only denied his claim, but went further, declaring that African Americans had no rights which white men were bound to respect. The ruling sent shockwaves across the nation. In the North, outrage boiled. In the South, the decision was celebrated as validation. The divide deepened into a canyon. And then there was John Brown, a fierce abolitionist who believed slavery would only end through blood. Brown led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859. His plan was to spark a massive slave uprising. The raid failed, and Brown was captured and hanged, but his execution made him a martyr in the North and a symbol of terror in the South. The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood he had declared, and many began to believe he was right. By the election of 1860, the nation was a powder keg. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. To Southerners, it was proof they had lost their voice in national politics. Almost immediately, states began to secede, declaring they were leaving the Union to protect their rights and way of life, meaning slavery. South Carolina went first in December 1860, followed by others. By early 1861, the Confederate States of America had been born complete with its own president, Jefferson Davis. For Northerners, secession was seen as rebellion, an attack on the very idea of a united nation. For Southerners, it was framed as self-defense. Each side believed history and justice were on its side. And between them stood the looming figure of Lincoln, about to step into a presidency unlike any before. Imagine the mood in those months, the uneasy silence in northern towns, where families read newspapers filled with talk of disunion, the heated meetings in southern courthouses where men cheered speeches about liberty while ignoring the chains that bound millions. It was a nation split down the middle, and everyone could feel it. The Revolution had birthed the United States. Expansion had stretched it across a continent. But now, slavery, the contradiction at its core, was about to tear it apart. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here, gathering speed, ready to break. By the spring of 1861, the storm had broken. On April 12th, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Cannon smoke rolled across the water, echoing like thunder. The garrison surrendered, and with that, the United States was at war with itself. Neighbors, who had once traded goods across county lines, now pointed rifles at each other. Families split down the middle, with brothers marching under different flags. The Civil War had begun. At first, both sides thought the war would be quick. The North, with its larger population factories and railroads, assumed it could crush the rebellion in a few months. The South, smaller but fierce, believed that determination, knowledge of the land, and perhaps European support would secure independence. Soldiers marched off to early battles, with picnic baskets trailing behind them, spectators eager to watch what they thought would be a brief spectacle. They were wrong. The first major clash came at Bull Run in July 1861. Union troops pushed forward confidently, but Confederate reinforcements held firm. General Thomas Jackson earned the nickname Stonewall for standing his ground, and Union soldiers fled in a chaotic retreat, trampling picnickers on the way. Any illusions of a short, tidy war vanished that day. This would be long, bloody, and brutal. The North, under President Abraham Lincoln, fought to preserve the Union. The South, under President Jefferson Davis, fought for independence, and beneath all the rhetoric, for the preservation of slavery. The battlefield stretched across forests, rivers, and farms. Muskets cracked, cannons roared, and the smell of gunpowder and blood hung heavy in the air. For ordinary soldiers, the war was misery. Marches stretched for miles under blistering sun or freezing rain. Food was scarce, often hardtack biscuits. So tough, soldiers joked they could stop bullets. Camps swarmed with lice and disease, and infection killed more men than bullets ever did. Letters home carried both pride and despair, ink blotted with tears. Imagine a farm boy from Ohio writing by lantern light, telling his mother not to worry, even as cannon fire rumbled in the distance. The tide of war ebbed and flowed. The Union won key victories at places like Antietam in 1862, the bloodiest single day in American history, with more than 20,000 casualties. The battlefield was so thick with bodies that survivors spoke of walking over the dead. Lincoln used the moment to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate-held territories were free. It didn't immediately liberate all enslaved people, but it changed the war's meaning. The Union was no longer just fighting to preserve itself. It was fighting to end slavery. The South struck back with daring generals like Robert E. Lee, whose leadership brought stunning victories despite being outnumbered. His invasion of the North culminated in the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, a three-day struggle that left more than 50,000 men dead or wounded. The fields were littered with muskets, boots, and letters never sent. When Lincoln later stood on that ground to give his Gettysburg address, he spoke for just 2 minutes, reminding the nation that it was fighting for a new birth of freedom. His words were short, but thundered louder than any cannon. The war stretched on, grinding through towns and countrysides. Railroads became lifelines, moving troops and supplies. The telegraph carried news in hours instead of weeks. It was a modern war in many ways, yet still fought with bayonets and horses. Women stepped into roles they'd never held before, running farms, working in factories, nursing the wounded. Figures like Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, braved battlefields to tend the injured, earning the nickname the Angel of the Battlefield. For enslaved people, the war became a chance for liberation. Thousands fled plantations, seeking refuge with Union forces. Some joined the army, fighting for their own freedom. The sight of black soldiers in Union blue carrying rifles was revolutionary in itself. Their courage on the battlefield proved what abolitionists had long argued, that slavery was not only cruel, but utterly indefensible. By 1864, the Union's fortunes shifted under generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Grant pressed Lee's army relentlessly in Virginia, accepting staggering casualties, but never letting go. Sherman, meanwhile, marched through Georgia, burning Atlanta and cutting a swath of destruction to the sea. His goal was to break the South's will to fight, and his march to the sea left a scar that still lingers in Southern memory. Finally, in April 1865, the war ground to its end. Lee, surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse, met Grant to surrender. The two men, both weary and dignified, agreed to terms that allowed Confederate soldiers to return home. After 4 years, 600,000 dead, and countless lives shattered, the war was over. The Union was preserved, and slavery was broken, though the struggle for true freedom was far from complete. But even in victory, tragedy struck. Just days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington. A bullet ended his life, and with it, the steady hand that might have guided the nation's healing. The news stunned the country, bells tolled, crowds wept, and a train carried Lincoln's body across miles of mourning towns. Imagine the silence that followed. Farms lay in ruins. Cities burned, families forever divided. Freedmen walked uncertain roads, tasting liberty, but facing hostility at every turn. Veterans limped home to empty chairs at dinner tables. The war had answered the question of union, but it had left behind a nation scarred grieving and unsure of how to stitch itself back together. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture the stillness after the cannons fell silent. Fields once thundered, with armies now lay quiet grass growing over graves. A flag still flew, tattered but unbroken. The Union had survived, but the work of making it whole again was only just beginning. The cannons had fallen silent in 1865, but the United States was far from healed. The Civil War had ended slavery and preserved the Union, but it also left a nation scarred, its fields, trampled its cities, burned its families, divided by grief. Nearly 600,000 soldiers were dead, and millions more bore wounds you couldn't always see. Now came the hardest part: how to rebuild a country that had nearly destroyed itself. This period would be called Reconstruction, but to many who lived it, the word felt too simple for the chaos that followed. The South was devastated. Plantations lay in ruins, railroads torn apart, towns reduced to ash. Enslaved people, 4 million strong, suddenly found themselves free, but free to what freedom came, without land, without resources, without guarantees. Families that had been split apart under slavery tried desperately to reunite, walking hundreds of miles in search of lost children, spouses, and parents. The sheer human determination was staggering. Imagine the joy of finding a long-lost brother after years apart, or the heartbreak of realizing a loved one was gone forever. To help, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. It was tasked with providing food, clothing, education, and legal aid to freed people. Bureau agents set up schools, some of the first accessible to African Americans in the South. Children learned to read, parents studied letters late at night by flickering candlelight. Education, once forbidden, became a symbol of freedom. But the Bureau faced overwhelming challenges: too little funding, too few agents, and constant hostility from white Southerners who saw its work as an attack on their way of life. Politically, the question was thorny. How should the South be brought back into the Union? President Abraham Lincoln, before his assassination, had favored a lenient approach. His 10% plan would allow Southern states to rejoin if just 10% of their voters swore loyalty to the Union. But after Lincoln's death, his successor, Andrew Johnson, took the reins. Johnson, a Southerner loyal to the Union, was stubborn, combative, and deeply resistant to granting rights to freed people. His lenient policies allowed many former Confederates to return to power, and before long, Southern legislatures passed Black Codes laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans. These codes restricted movement, employment, and civil rights, aiming to force freed people back into conditions not far from slavery. Congress, led by a group known as the Radical Republicans, pushed back hard. They argued that Reconstruction must guarantee real rights for freed people and transform the South. In 1867, they passed the Reconstruction Acts, dividing the South into 5 military districts and requiring states to write new constitutions that enfranchised black men. For the first time in American history, African American men could vote and hold office in significant numbers. The results were astonishing. Across the South, black legislators entered state houses and even the U.S. Congress. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first African American senator in 1870, a living rebuke to centuries of exclusion. For freed people, Reconstruction was a time of fragile hope. Families built churches that became centers of community and resistance. Cooperative farms were attempted, and some land was redistributed, though most promises of 40 acres and a mule never materialized. The dream of independence was real, but so were the obstacles. Many freed people ended up as sharecroppers, trapped in cycles of debt that echoed slavery in everything but name. White resistance was fierce. The Ku Klux Klan emerged in the late 1860s, draped in hoods and robes, wielding terror as a weapon. They attacked black voters, teachers, and political leaders, burning schools and churches. Night riders galloped through fields to enforce white supremacy through fear. Federal troops and laws cracked down, but the violence never fully stopped. Reconstruction was not just about rebuilding states. It was about contesting the very meaning of freedom. Meanwhile, the nation as a whole wrestled with its identity. 3 new amendments reshaped the Constitution. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th guaranteed equal protection under the law. And the 15th granted voting rights to black men. On paper, the United States had taken a leap toward justice. In practice, those rights were constantly undermined. It was one thing to write equality into law. It was another to enforce it in hostile towns where old prejudices still ruled. Economically, the North surged ahead with industry railroads and factories, while the South lagged, clinging to agriculture. Politically, tensions between President Johnson and Congress exploded. Johnson vetoed Reconstruction bills, and Congress overrode him. Eventually, the House impeached Johnson, though the Senate acquitted him by a single vote. The message was clear. The president's vision for Reconstruction had failed. By the 1870s, fatigue was setting in. The North grew tired of pouring resources into Southern transformation. Corruption scandals rocked the federal government, and the Panic of 1873 triggered a severe depression. Many Northerners began to turn inward, focusing on their own economic troubles, rather than the unfinished business of Reconstruction. The final blow came with the contested election of 1876. A backroom deal, known as the Compromise of 1877, handed the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. With that, Reconstruction effectively ended. White Redeemer governments quickly seized power, rolling back reforms, suppressing black political participation, and laying the groundwork for Jim Crow segregation. For freed people, the retreat was devastating. The brief window of political power and hope slammed shut, replaced by decades of disenfranchisement and violence. Reconstruction had promised a revolution in American life, but its gains were fragile, and many were lost in the backlash. Still, the legacy remained. Schools had been built, communities had strengthened, and the 14th and 15th Amendments endured as tools for future generations to wield. Imagine the mood of those years, a black farmer voting for the first time, his hand trembling as he dropped a ballot into the box. A white landowner watching bitterly, muttering about lost power. A school teacher in a one-room cabin, chalk dust on her fingers, writing the alphabet on a board while children repeated it eagerly. These were not abstract struggles. They were lived daily battles over dignity, rights, and survival. Reconstruction was not a neat ending to the Civil War, but a messy continuation of it by other means. The Union had been preserved, yes, but what kind of Union would it be? One that honored liberty and truth, or one that paid lip service while clinging to old chains? That question haunted every courtroom, every ballot box, every field, plowed by free but struggling hands. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet picture, the South of the 1870s town scarred by fire, new schools glowing with lamplight and shadows of riders moving through the night. Picture the fragile balance of hope and fear that defined the era. Reconstruction was America's second chance at freedom, and though much of it slipped away, its echoes still shape the nation's story. The Civil War and Reconstruction had left the United States battered but standing. As the 19th century rolled on, the country began to change shape, not just on maps, but in its very bones. Steel beams rose where wooden beams once sufficed railroads, carved across plains and cities, swelled with new arrivals. By the 1870s and 1880s, America was entering what came to be called the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, who loved pointing out that beneath the glitter of gold lay plenty of rust. On the surface, the age dazzled. Wealth piled up at a staggering pace. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, knitting the country together like never before. Steel mills in Pittsburgh glowed red hot through the night, belching smoke that painted skies an angry gray. Oil gushers in Pennsylvania spewed black wealth from the ground. Telegraph wires hummed with constant chatter. And soon, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone made voices leap across miles. To many, it seemed as if progress itself had put on boots and was sprinting forward. But progress came with price tags. Immigrants arrived by the millions drawn by promises of opportunity. Ships poured into New York Harbor, and at Ellis Island families shuffled through long lines, their names misheard and misspelled by weary clerks. Imagine standing in that echoing hall, clutching your few belongings, heart pounding at the thought of a new life. Germans, Italians, Irish Poles, Chinese, and countless others crowded into America's cities, swelling tenements to bursting. Apartments were often dark, airless, and stuffed with more bodies than beds. Children played in alleys where the smell of garbage lingered, and water pumps sometimes delivered more cholera than refreshment. Still, life pressed on. Street vendors shouted their wares newspapers sold for a penny, and laborers trudged off to sweatshops that crammed hundreds into rooms hot enough to wilt steel. Wages were low hours long, and safety nearly non-existent. Fingers were lost in machines, lungs choked on coal dust, and bosses rarely cared. But the paychecks, however meager, kept food on the table. Meanwhile, a small group of men rose to towering heights of wealth and power. They were called industrialists by admirers and robber barons by critics. John D. Rockefeller built an oil empire so vast that Standard Oil seemed to flow through every lamp in the nation. Andrew Carnegie turned steel into the skeleton of modern cities, his mills grinding day and night. Cornelius Vanderbilt ruled railroads, and J.P. Morgan wielded finance like a weapon. Their fortunes reached into the tens of millions numbers, almost unimaginable to ordinary workers earning $1 a day. Mansions lined Fifth Avenue in New York, glittering with chandeliers and gilded furniture, while only blocks away, children went to bed hungry. Laborers, unsurprisingly, began to push back. Strikes erupted across the country. In 1877, a massive railroad strike spread like wildfire, halting trains and sparking violent clashes with police and militias. Factories shuttered, cities burned, and troops were called in. The message was clear. Workers were tired of being ground down in the gears of progress. Union movements began to grow, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, and better pay. Their efforts met fierce resistance. Employers hired strikebreakers, private detectives, and sometimes even federal troops to keep order. The Haymarket Riot in Chicago in 1886, which began as a peaceful rally for the 8-hour workday, ended in blood when a bomb exploded, killing several policemen. Newspapers branded labor activists as radicals, anarchists, even enemies of the state. Yet amid all the struggle, there was also innovation. Thomas Edison tinkered with light bulbs until nights glowed brighter than ever. Nikola Tesla dreamed of currents leaping invisibly through the air. Cities began to buzz with electricity subways and steel bridges. Imagine walking across the newly built Brooklyn Bridge in 1883, its cables gleaming in the sun, the skyline beginning to bristle with vertical ambition. The bridge seemed to say, America was not just surviving, it was reinventing itself. But reinvention was uneven. In the South, Reconstruction had collapsed into Jim Crow. Laws enforced segregation. Black voters were pushed from the polls, and violence kept racial hierarchies in place. In the West, Native nations faced relentless pressure. The frontier was closing buffalo herds, dwindled to near extinction, and military campaigns forced tribes onto reservations. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defeated General Custer, was a flash of resistance, but it did not stop the tide. Wounded Knee in 1890, where hundreds of Lakota were massacred, marked the tragic coda of Native armed resistance. For women, too, the era was complicated. Many labored in factories, or as domestic servants, their wages far lower than men's. But they also organized. Clubs, societies, and suffrage groups spread, arguing that women deserved a voice in politics. Figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton carried the torch of activism, even as the right to vote remained just out of reach. The Gilded Age was also an age of spectacle. Vaudeville theaters offered cheap entertainment, mixing comedy song and acrobatics. Baseball emerged as the national pastime, drawing crowds to ballparks, where cheers echoed across wooden bleachers. World's fairs displayed everything from electric lights to giant Ferris wheels, dazzling visitors with visions of the future. And behind it all, the newspapers of Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst shouted headlines in giant type, selling drama as much as news. So what was America in these decades? A land of promise and paradox, a place where fortunes were made overnight while children stitched clothes in dim rooms. A land where steel skeletons rose toward the sky while farmers still plowed with mules. A republic that prided itself on liberty while millions faced exclusion prejudice or outright violence. Twain's gilded was the perfect word. The surface glittered, but scratch it, and you'd find cracks. Yet the energy was undeniable. The hum of factories, the shriek of train, whistles the chatter of immigrants in dozens of languages. It was messy, loud, and often unjust, but it was alive. The United States was no longer just an experiment on the edge of the Atlantic. It was becoming an industrial giant, restless, ambitious, and determined to shape the century to come. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the glow of lamplight in a crowded tenement window, the clang of a steel hammer echoing through Pittsburgh, the distant whistle of a midnight train. The Gilded Age was a time when dreams and hardships walked side by side, gilded and rusted all at once. Beneath the shine lay struggle, but also the beating heart of a nation reinventing itself for a new era. By the turn of the 20th century, the shine of the Gilded Age was beginning to tarnish. Yes, fortunes had been made, bridges built, and cities electrified, but behind the glow were cracks too big to ignore. Corruption ran through politics like ivy up a brick wall. Factories squeezed every ounce out of workers, and tenements crammed families into suffocating rooms. The country needed a change, or at least a tune-up. Enter the Progressive Era, a time when reformers rolled up their sleeves, sharpened their pencils, and decided to give America a bit of tough love. Progressives weren't a single group, but a loose coalition. Middle-class reformers, journalists, politicians, even a few wealthy philanthropists who realized maybe it wasn't a great look to sip champagne while children stitched their shirts. Their concerns spanned everything: child labor, unsafe food, women's suffrage, political corruption, working hours, and public health. They wanted cleaner cities, fairer laws, and a government that didn't always look the other way. Journalists played a big role. Known as muckrakers, a nickname given by Theodore Roosevelt, who meant it half as an insult, half as a compliment, they dug through society's filth to expose corruption. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle peeled back the curtain on the meatpacking industry, describing rat-spoiled meat and conditions so grim that readers swore off sausages for weeks. Ida Tarbell, took aim at Rockefeller's Standard Oil, showing how monopoly power crushed competition. Lincoln Steffens exposed political graft in city governments. Their stories shocked readers into realizing that progress sometimes smelled very bad. Politicians began to respond. Theodore Roosevelt, that barrel-chested whirlwind of energy, barreled into the presidency in 1901 after William McKinley's assassination. Roosevelt loved to charge up San Juan Hill into speeches and into reform. He busted trusts, regulated railroads, and pushed for conservation setting aside millions of acres as national parks and forests. He once said he spoke softly and carried a big stick, but truthfully, Roosevelt tended to speak loudly and swing the stick round like a marching band baton. Progress wasn't limited to politics. Women were pushing harder for their place in democracy. Suffragists marched, protested, and lobbied, demanding the vote. They faced jeers, arrests, and even force-feeding during hunger strikes, but their determination never wavered. By the 1910s, momentum was undeniable. The 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was on the horizon, though not yet achieved. Labor movements gained traction too. Unions fought for shorter hours and safer conditions. Tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, where 146 workers, mostly young immigrant women, died when doors were locked and fire escapes failed, shocked the public. Outrage fueled calls for reform, and new safety laws slowly took shape. Technology and culture shifted as well. Automobiles sputtered onto city streets, confusing horses and thrilling crowds. Henry Ford perfected the assembly line, cranking out Model Ts, cheap enough for ordinary families. Cities grew upward with skyscrapers and outward with streetcars. Jazz bubbled in saloons, and ragtime spilled from pianos in crowded dance halls. The nation was restless, energetic, and at times overwhelmed by its own speed. But America wasn't just changing at home. Abroad, it was flexing new muscles. The Spanish-American War of 1898 had left the U.S. with overseas territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. By the early 1900s, the U.S. was no longer just a big country, it was an emerging global power. Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet of battleships around the world as a floating reminder that America was ready to play in the big leagues. And then came the Great War. In 1914, Europe plunged into chaos as alliances, rivalries, and one fateful assassination set the continent ablaze. At first, the United States stayed out, watching from across the Atlantic as trench warfare chewed through millions of lives. Americans read about mud-soaked soldiers, machine gun fire, and poison gas shaking their heads in horror. President Woodrow Wilson even campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But staying out didn't last. German submarines began sinking ships, including those carrying American passengers. Then came the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany tried to coax Mexico into attacking the U.S. in exchange for lost territories. That was enough. In 1917, America declared war. The country mobilized with dizzying speed. Millions of men were drafted factories, retooled for war production, and propaganda posters plastered walls with calls to buy bonds and conserve food. For soldiers, the war was unlike anything they'd imagined. Trench life meant mud up to the knees, rats as large as cats, and the constant whistle of shells overhead. Letters home spoke of longing fear and the surreal quiet between bombardments. Over there, as the song went, they fought in battles with names like Belleau Wood and the Meuse Argonne. American troops, fresh and full of energy, tipped the balance in 1918, helping the Allies push Germany back. At home, life transformed. Women entered factories in larger numbers, filling roles left vacant by men. African Americans migrated north in the Great Migration, seeking wartime jobs and escaping Southern oppression, reshaping the demographics of cities like Chicago and Detroit. Patriotic fervor ran high, but so did suspicion. Those who spoke out against the war sometimes faced jail under new sedition laws. The line between unity and coercion blurred, and then just as victory loomed, a new enemy appeared: the influenza pandemic of 1918. Soldiers carried it home, and it swept across the globe, killing millions far more than the war itself. Streets emptied, families mourned, and masks became as common as uniforms. The war might have ended in November 1918, but the flu reminded everyone that peace didn't guarantee safety. When the guns finally fell silent, President Wilson crossed the Atlantic, dreaming of a new world order. His 14 points called for peace, self-determination, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. The vision was noble, but at home, senators balked. They feared entangling alliances, and America refused to join the very league Wilson had championed. The country turned inward, weary of sacrifice and suspicious of foreign commitments. The progressive spirit lingered, but it too was changing. Americans had seen reform at home and war abroad, and they longed for stability. The 1920s would bring jazz prohibition speakeasies and a roller coaster of cultural change, but also the uneasy memory of how fragile progress could be. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the clatter of typewriters in newspaper offices exposing corruption, the rumble of an assembly line turning out cars, the echo of marching boots in muddy French trenches. Imagine mothers teaching children to read by lamplight, while newsboys shouted headlines about both reform and war. The Progressive Era and the Great War were about hope and heartbreak, in equal measure a reminder that even when a nation is busy fixing itself, the wider world has a way of demanding attention. When the guns of the Great War finally went quiet in 1918, Americans exhaled, and then almost immediately inhaled the heady air of the Roaring Twenties. The nation had survived industrial growing pains, muckraking reformers, and the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. Now people wanted fun speed and a little bit of sparkle. It was as if the country, weary from sacrifice, collectively decided, let's dance until we forget. And dance they did. Jazz spilled out of smoky clubs, horns blaring pianos, pounding the syncopated rhythms, electrifying listeners. In New Orleans, Chicago, and Harlem, musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington transformed sound into rebellion and joy. The Harlem Renaissance blossomed a cultural flowering of black writers, artists, and thinkers: Langston Hughes, Zora, Neil Hurston, and countless others who declared that African American identity was not just surviving, but thriving. Their words and music pulsed with pride, wit, and defiance. Flappers symbolized the new spirit. Young women bobbed their hair, shortened their skirts, and kicked up their heels in smoky dance halls. They smoked cigarettes, drank cocktails, and laughed loudly in public, the horror. To their parents, they seemed scandalous. To themselves, they were free. America was in love with modernity, and modernity looked like a woman who could Charleston until sunrise. Technology only fueled the frenzy. Radios crackled in homes, carrying baseball games and jazz into living rooms. Automobiles, thanks to Henry Ford's assembly line, rolled off production floors by the millions, giving ordinary families freedom to roam. Couples sped down dusty back roads, the rumble of engines replacing the creak of horse carts. Skyscrapers clawed higher into the sky, and electric lights turned night into day. If the 19th century had been about stretching across land, the 20th was about stretching upward and outward at dizzying speed. But under all the glitter cracks formed, the 1920s were a paradox. While jazz soared, the Ku Klux Klan resurged, parading in white robes not just in the South, but in northern cities too. Immigration quotas tightened, aimed at keeping out those deemed undesirable. The decade's energy was exhilarating, but it was also anxious progress collided with prejudice in every corner. Then there was Prohibition. The 18th Amendment, passed in 1919, banned the sale of alcohol. Reformers had dreamed it would purify society, eliminate crime, and make families happier. Instead, it created speakeasies, bootleggers, and gangsters who made fortunes supplying illegal liquor. Al Capone turned Chicago into his personal kingdom of smuggling and shootouts. In hidden bars, flappers sipped gin cocktails, while jazz bands played on, and federal agents stumbled in, trying to shut it all down. Prohibition was supposed to tame America's wild side. Instead, it taught the country how much fun breaking the rules could be. Economically, the 1920s glittered too. Stocks soared, fortunes multiplied, and ordinary people poured savings into the market convinced it would rise forever. Radios, cars, and refrigerators flew off shelves. Advertising became an industry in itself, selling not just products, but dreams. Dreams of glamour, wealth, and effortless success. The decade roared with optimism, a nation convinced the good times would never end. But of course they did. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. Prices plummeted, fortunes evaporated, and the party ended with a sickening thud. Suddenly, the glitter looked cheap. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. Families who had bought homes on credit lost them, lining up instead at soup kitchens. Proud men sold apples on street corners, their hats pulled low to hide shame. The Great Depression had arrived, and it was merciless. Dust storms swept across the Great Plains, turning farmland into deserts. Families piled belongings into rickety cars and headed west, chasing rumors of work. John Steinbeck would later immortalize them in The Grapes of Wrath, but at the time, they were simply migrants, desperate and exhausted. In cities, bread lines stretched around blocks. Children went to bed. Hungry mothers stitched patches onto worn clothes. Fathers searched endlessly for jobs that no longer existed. And yet people endured. In shanty towns, sarcastically called Hoovervilles, families cobbled together shelters from scraps, naming them after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the crisis. The radio became a lifeline. Families huddled around sets to hear news music or just distraction. Baseball carried on, giving fans something to cheer about, even as wallets stayed empty. Humor, too, survived. Comedians like the Marx Brothers reminded audiences that laughter was free, even when bread was not. The Depression revealed how fragile prosperity could be, and how interconnected the nation's fortunes had become. What began as a financial crash spiraled into a social catastrophe. People who had once believed in endless progress suddenly questioned everything. Could democracy survive when stomachs were empty? Could capitalism be trusted when banks devoured savings? By the early 1930s, answers would come from new leaders and new ideas. But in the depths of the Depression, the future looked bleak. For all the jazz, the flappers and the skyscrapers of the 1920s, the 1930s had replaced neon with shadows and cocktails with breadlines. The party was over, and the hangover was national. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet, imagine the rhythms of two Americas. One, the jazz of the 1920s trumpets, blaring glasses, clinking shoes, tapping on wooden floors. The other, the silence of the 1930s, a bread line stretching in the cold footsteps, shuffling stomachs empty. Both rhythms shape the nation, reminding us that history doesn't move in straight lines. It roars, it collapses, it rebuilds, and through it all, life goes on. The 1930s had left America weary, its people battered by the Great Depression. But the storm clouds gathering overseas made breadlines look almost tame by comparison. In Europe and Asia, dictators rose, borders were crossed, and the world inched toward a new conflict. For Americans, it began as distant thunder. By the decade's end, it was a storm so massive that no ocean could keep it away. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime marched in lockstep, fueled by propaganda rage and terrifying ambition. In Italy, Mussolini's fascists flexed their muscles. In Japan, militarists expanded across Asia, invading China and eyeing the Pacific. The world had not yet recovered from the war. To end all wars, and already another and even greater one was unfolding. At first, Americans wanted no part of it. Memories of World War I were still raw, and isolationism was strong. The U.S. passed neutrality acts determined not to be dragged into another European bloodbath. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected president in 1932, focused on pulling the nation out of economic despair with the New Deal. But even as jobs programs, Social Security, and public works gave relief, Roosevelt watched the world, carefully aware that America might not have the luxury of sitting this one out. By 1939, Hitler had invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war. Europe exploded into chaos. Americans listened on radios, following battles with both fear and detachment. Then in 1940, France fell. Britain stood alone, bombed nightly by the Luftwaffe. Roosevelt moved cautiously, supplying aid through programs like Lend-Lease shipping weapons and supplies to Britain, while still officially staying neutral. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars, he promised, though privately he knew the tide was pulling the U.S. closer. The breaking point came on December 7, 1941. Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, dropping bombs that turned battleships into twisted steel. Smoke billowed, sailors scrambled, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed. A date which will live in infamy. Roosevelt declared, and Congress declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy soon declared war on the U.S. In a matter of days, isolationism vanished. The United States was fully in World War II. Mobilization was swift and staggering. Factories retooled overnight. Instead of cars, they made tanks. Instead of sewing machines, they turned out parachutes. Women poured into the workforce, symbolized by Rosie, the riveter, flexing her arm under the slogan, "We can do it." For many, it was the first time they'd earned wages outside the home, and it reshaped gender roles permanently. Children collected scrap metal, families rationed sugar and gasoline, and victory gardens sprouted in backyards. The nation buzzed with purpose. On the battlefront, American soldiers, GIs, were shipped across oceans. In North Africa, they fought to pry the desert from Axis control. In Italy, they slogged up mountains. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Imagine the chaos boats grinding into sand ramps, dropping soldiers charging through surf under machine gun fire. The losses were horrific, but the beachhead held, and within months, Allied forces pushed into France. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, a different war raged island by island. American forces fought brutal battles at places like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Jungle heat disease and fanatical resistance made every advance costly. The iconic image of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi in Iwo Jima captured the grit of a campaign where victory meant staggering sacrifice. At home, the war effort was not without shadows. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were rounded up and sent to internment camps, stripped of homes and businesses. Fear and prejudice outweighed justice, a stain on democracy, even in its fight for freedom abroad. African American soldiers served with distinction, but often in segregated units. The famed Tuskegee Airmen black fighter pilots proved their skill in the skies, but still faced discrimination on the ground. The war forced America to confront its own contradictions, even as it fought tyranny overseas. By 1945, the Allies had crushed Nazi Germany. Hitler was dead. Berlin was rubble, and the Holocaust's horrors, death camps, gas chambers, mountains of shoes and glasses staggered the world. The war in Europe was over, but in the Pacific, Japan fought on. The U.S. prepared for a bloody invasion, but then came a weapon unlike anything before. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, flattening the city in a blinding flash. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The devastation was unimaginable. Tens of thousands killed instantly, many more in the weeks and months after. Japan surrendered. The war was over. In total, World War II cost more than 400,000 American lives and tens of millions worldwide. But it also left the United States transformed. Factories that had churned out tanks and planes now stood ready to produce cars and appliances. Women who had worked in shipyards and offices weren't all eager to return to old roles. Soldiers came home with new expectations, and GI Bills offered education and housing that built a rising middle class. The war had not just saved democracy abroad, it had reshaped it at home. Yet victory brought new responsibility. The United States emerged not just as a survivor, but as a superpower. The Soviet Union, once an ally, now loomed as a rival. Europe was in ruins, Asia in turmoil, and the atomic bomb had changed the rules forever. The fight for freedom had been won, but the world was already shifting into the uneasy glare of the Cold War. Still, for a moment, in 1945, there was relief. Soldiers kissed sweethearts in Times Square, confetti rained from skyscrapers, and bells rang in churches across the nation. Families hugged sons they thought they'd lost. A weary people finally allowed themselves to hope that maybe peace would last this time. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet, imagine the sound of a radio crackling with Roosevelt's voice, the clang of factory hammers turning out Liberty ships, the steady march of boots on cobblestone streets in Europe. Imagine the cheers when news of victory spread the sighs of relief and the tears of grief for those who never came home. World War II was both triumph and tragedy, a crucible that reshaped America and the world forever. The guns of World War II had barely cooled before a new tension crackled across the globe. The United States stood tall, victorious, and powerful, but so did the Soviet Union. Both had fought against Nazi Germany, but their visions for the future couldn't have been more different. America spoke of democracy and capitalism, the Soviets of communism and revolution. It was like two roommates who had joined forces to kick out a terrible landlord, only to realize afterward that they couldn't agree on how to decorate the apartment, or who actually owned the lease. The Cold War wasn't fought in one giant battle. Instead, it was a constant chess game with pawns moved on every continent. Europe was the board's center square. After the war, Germany was carved into zones of occupation, and Berlin, the old capital, became a divided city. In 1948, when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin to starve out the Allies, the U.S. responded with the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, American planes dropped food, coal, and supplies from the sky. Imagine children running into fields to catch candy bars tied to parachutes, proof that sometimes goodwill could ride on the back of propellers. But beneath the goodwill was fear. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, and suddenly America's monopoly on doomsday was gone. The world entered the age of mutually assured destruction, a phrase so grim, it's amazing anyone managed to sleep at night. Fallout shelters popped up in suburban basements. Schools held duck-and-cover drills where children hid under desks, as if thin wood and chewing gum could stop a nuclear blast. The irony was thick kids practiced crouching in hallways while adults debated how many missiles were too many. Meanwhile, hot wars broke out in cold shadows. In Korea, 1950, communist forces invaded the South. The U.S. intervened under the banner of the United Nations, sending troops into a brutal conflict of freezing winters, bloody stalemates, and shifting battle lines. 3 years later, an armistice froze the war along the 38th parallel, leaving Korea divided to this day. For Americans, the Korean War was the first taste of fighting communism directly, and a reminder that the Cold War wasn't always cold. Back home, paranoia spread. Senator Joseph McCarthy made headlines with wild claims that communists had infiltrated government Hollywood, even the military. Careers were ruined as actors, writers, and teachers were blacklisted. Neighbors eyed each other suspiciously. Loyalty oaths and FBI files piled up. The fear of nuclear annihilation merged with the fear of spies turning the 1950s into a decade of both prosperity and paranoia. And yet amid the dread, America boomed. Soldiers returned home to GI Bill benefits, fueling suburban growth. Rows of identical houses sprang up, each with trimmed lawns, shiny cars, and children riding bikes in cul-de-sacs. Television flickered into living rooms, selling soap and sitcoms that depicted idealized families where problems were solved in 22 minutes. Rock and roll burst onto the scene, Elvis Presley shaking hips, Chuck Berry bending guitar strings, and teenagers suddenly had a culture of their own. The Cold War backdrop made the normalcy of suburbia feel like defiance. Life, laughter, and consumerism were weapons too. Then in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. A beeping ball of metal, no bigger than a beach ball, set off panic in Washington. If they could put a satellite in space, what else could they launch? Schools rushed to teach math and science, and the U.S. created NASA to catch up. The space race was on turning the heavens into yet another frontier of rivalry. The 1960s turned up the heat. In Cuba, Fidel Castro's revolution brought communism to America's doorstep. In 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet missiles being installed on the island. The Cuban Missile Crisis followed 13 days when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev played a deadly staring contest, while Americans watched news broadcasts, wondering if tomorrow might bring mushroom clouds. At the last moment, diplomacy prevailed. The missiles were withdrawn, and the world exhaled. But the Cold War wasn't only about threats, it was also about ambition. In 1961, Kennedy had promised to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. In 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto lunar dust and declared, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The space race, at least for that moment, was won. Millions watched on television, awed by the idea that human footprints now marked the moon. It was a triumph of science and symbolism, proof that competition could push humanity beyond Earth itself. Yet not all frontiers were so inspiring. In Vietnam, the U.S. became entangled in a war that dragged on for years, costing lives and faith in equal measure. What began as support for the South against communist North Vietnam turned into a quagmire of jungles protests and nightly news broadcasts showing the war's brutal reality. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, America was deeply divided: hawks versus doves, soldiers versus protesters, old versus young. The Cold War had reached into America's soul, testing its unity as much as its armies. And through it all, nuclear weapons remained the shadow looming overhead. Arms races piled warheads into silos and submarines. Scientists developed bombs more powerful than the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Politicians made speeches about peace while quietly approving budgets that could end the world several times over. It was a bizarre, balanced prosperity and paranoia, progress and fear. Imagine life in those decades. One evening, you might sit on a porch in a quiet suburb, listening to a transistor radio, children chasing fireflies in the yard. The next morning, you might practice crouching under a desk for an atomic drill. You'd cheer when astronauts walked on the moon, then frown at headlines about soldiers bogged down in jungles. The Cold War was everywhere and nowhere shaping daily life without ever exploding into the nightmare everyone feared. By the 1970s, the struggle was far from over. Détente treaties and diplomacy offered moments of calm, but the rivalry remained. Two superpowers glared across oceans, each armed with enough firepower to erase the planet. The Cold War wasn't just a contest of weapons, it was a contest of futures. And every invention, every policy, every cultural shift unfolded under its long, uneasy shadow. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet picture, the duality of that age, the beeping of Sputnik echoing through space, the laughter of children in tidy suburban streets, the hush of a classroom as students ducked under desks, the roar of rockets carrying humans into the stars. Fear and ambition walked hand in hand, shaping an America that dreamed big, even as it glanced nervously at the sky. The Cold War simmered in the background, but at home in America, another kind of struggle was heating up, one that wasn't about nuclear missiles or satellites, but about dignity, justice, and whose voices counted in a nation that had long claimed to stand for freedom. The mid-20th century became an era of civil rights marches, cultural revolutions, and seismic shifts that shook America's very identity. For African Americans, the promise of emancipation from a century earlier still hadn't translated into real equality. In the South, Jim Crow laws enforced segregation, turning everyday life into a system of humiliation. Separate schools, separate restaurants, separate water fountains. In the North, discrimination was subtler, but no less suffocating. Jobs denied, housing restricted, opportunities blocked. The contradiction was glaring. How could America champion freedom abroad while denying it at home? Change sparked in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white man. Her quiet defiance ignited a year-long bus boycott, led by a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. King's booming voice carried the message of nonviolent resistance, drawing on both Christian teachings and Gandhi's philosophy. His speeches painted visions of justice so vivid that they became part of America's conscience. "I have a dream," he would later declare, and millions believed it could be true. The movement grew. Sit-ins staged by black college students in Greensboro challenged segregated lunch counters. Freedom riders rolled through the South on buses, testing laws that had outlawed segregation, but were ignored in practice. They were beaten, jailed, but they kept rolling. Each act of courage chipped away at the old system. Television made the struggle impossible to ignore. Images of peaceful protesters attacked by police dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham shocked viewers nationwide. The March on Washington in 1963 gathered hundreds of thousands at the Lincoln Memorial, a sea of faces demanding justice. A year later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down barriers that had long kept black Americans from the polls. Legal victories were monumental, though racism and inequality didn't vanish with the stroke of a pen. But the 1960s weren't just about civil rights for African Americans. Other groups raised their voices too. Native American activists occupied Alcatraz Island in 1969, demanding recognition of treaty rights. Chicano movements pushed for labor rights and cultural pride. Women inspired by Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique launched the modern feminist movement, challenging expectations that their lives should be confined to kitchens and nurseries. The National Organization for Women Now fought for equal pay childcare and reproductive rights. Youth culture itself was in revolt. Rock music blared from radio's long hair, and bell-bottoms became uniforms of defiance, and campuses erupted with protests against the Vietnam War. Young Americans were no longer content to follow the script their parents had written. They questioned authority, experimented with new lifestyles, and marched against a war they saw as senseless. Woodstock in 1969 became a symbol of that counterculture, 500,000 young people camping in mud, swaying to guitars, declaring love and peace, while the world outside felt anything but peaceful. At the same time, the struggle for gay rights took a bold step forward. In 1969, patrons at the Stonewall Inn in New York resisted a police raid sparking days of protests. The Stonewall Uprising became a rallying cry, laying the foundation for the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement. What had once been whispered became shouted in marches and parades, demanding visibility and equality. The decade was also marked by profound tragedy. Leaders who embodied hope fell to violence. John F. Kennedy assassinated in 1963. Malcolm X in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Robert F. Kennedy just months later. Each killing felt like a wound to the nation's spirit, raising the haunting question, could America change without tearing itself apart? And yet, even amid the turmoil, progress flickered. The civil rights movement showed that grassroots action could shake the halls of power. Feminists won legal and cultural ground. Environmentalists, spurred by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, pushed for clean air and water laws. Activism was contagious. Once people saw change was possible, they demanded more. Of course, not everyone welcomed these revolutions. Backlash was fierce. White resistance to desegregation led to riots and the rise of law and order politics. Feminists were dismissed as troublemakers. Anti-war protesters were branded unpatriotic. The cultural divide grew wide, with one side calling for reform and the other for a return to tradition. Still, America was transforming. Walk through a city street in 1968, and you'd hear echoes of all the revolutions at once, a protest chant, a folk singer's guitar, the whir of a TV broadcasting images from Vietnam, the laughter of kids tossing frisbees in a park. The air buzzed with conflict and creativity, grief and hope. By the 1970s, the energy of the 1960s had scattered into new directions. Some victories had been won: desegregation voting rights, broader freedoms for women. Others remained unfinished, lingering challenges that would stretch into future decades. But what was clear was this: the America that entered the 1960s was not the same as the one that left it. A nation that had long silenced so many voices had now heard them shouting, singing, marching, and refusing to be ignored. Tonight, as you settle deeper under the covers, imagine the sounds of that era: the roar of a crowd on the National Mall, the strum of a guitar at Woodstock, the chants of marchers crossing a bridge in Selma, the solemn silence after news of yet another assassination. The civil rights and cultural revolutions were not quiet, but they reshaped the soul of a country still trying to live up to its own promise. The fires of the 1960s left America singed, but not extinguished. As the 1970s dawned, the nation carried the weight of civil rights struggles, cultural revolutions, and the long shadow of Vietnam. What followed was an era of scandal cynicism, innovation, and transformation, stretching from the resignation of a president to the collapse of towers in New York City. It began with Richard Nixon. Elected in 1968, on a promise of law and order, Nixon inherited a nation divided. He wound down U.S. involvement in Vietnam through a strategy called Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese forces to carry more of the fight. But as American troops trickled home, the war dragged on with televised bombings in Cambodia and protests erupting on campuses. At Kent State University in 1970, National Guard troops fired into a crowd of student demonstrators, killing 4. The images shocked the country, proof that the war's divisions reached into every corner of American life. Then came Watergate. In 1972, burglars tied to Nixon's re-election campaign were caught breaking into Democratic headquarters. What seemed like a small-time scandal unraveled into a web of cover-ups, tapes, and abuses of power. Night after night, Americans tuned in to watch hearings that peeled back the layers of corruption. By 1974, Nixon, facing certain impeachment, resigned, the first U.S. president ever to do so. For many, it confirmed their deepest fears that leaders could not be trusted, that power corrupted even in the land of democracy. Cynicism became a permanent resident in American politics. The 1970s brought other shocks too. The oil crisis of 1973 left drivers waiting in endless lines at gas stations, frustrated as prices soared. Inflation bit into wallets, jobs stagnated, and stagflation became the decade's grim mascot. The once booming post-war economy seemed to have run out of steam. At the same time, environmentalism surged. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, and Congress passed major laws for clean air, clean water, and endangered species. Out of pollution and oil spills grew a new awareness that progress came with costs and that the planet had limits. The 1980s arrived with Ronald Reagan, the former Hollywood actor who became the great communicator. With his sunny optimism and promises of smaller government, lower taxes, and strong defense, Reagan reshaped politics. His administration championed free market economics, deregulation, and a renewed Cold War stance against the evil empire of the Soviet Union. The military buildup was staggering: new missiles, stealth bombers, and the futuristic-sounding Star Wars missile defense program. Critics worried about deficits and inequality, but Reagan's charisma carried the day. America, he promised, was still a shining city on a hill. Culturally, the 1980s crackled with contradictions. Wall Street boomed, and yuppies flaunted designer suits and cell phones the size of bricks. MTV launched in 1981, turning music into a visual spectacle and catapulting artists like Michael Jackson and Madonna into superstardom. Video games arrived in arcades and living rooms as Pac-Man and Mario became household names. But beneath the neon lights lurked darker realities. The crack epidemic devastated communities. The AIDS crisis spread rapidly, first ignored, then fought with activism and heartbreak. America danced to synth pop, but it also grieved in hospital wards. Internationally, the Cold War reached its climax. The 1980s saw renewed tension, but also unexpectedly the beginning of the end. By the late decade, Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union, glasnost openness, and perestroika restructuring signaled cracks in the Iron Curtain. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, crowds chipping away at the concrete that had divided East and West for nearly 3 decades. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The Cold War was over. America suddenly was the world's lone superpower. The fear of nuclear annihilation faded, replaced by triumph and uncertainty about what came next. The 1990s offered answers of a sort. The U.S. fought a quick, high-tech war in the Persian Gulf, pushing Saddam Hussein's Iraq out of Kuwait in 1991. Televised in real time with night vision footage and smart bombs, the Gulf War looked like a video game to viewers at home. Victory was swift, but the seeds of future conflict were planted in the sands of the Middle East. At home, the 1990s were a mix of prosperity and cultural transformation. The internet began creeping into offices and homes with its dial-up tones and clunky websites. Personal computers, once rare, became essential. Bill Clinton, elected in 1992, presided over economic growth and cultural debates. His presidency was marked by both optimism, balanced budgets, tech booms, and scandal, culminating in impeachment after a very public affair. Like Watergate, it left Americans divided, weary of politics, yet unable to look away. Culture surged in all directions. Hip-hop moved from the streets to the mainstream, giving voice to anger, pride, and creativity. Grunge rock spilled out of Seattle, with Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit becoming an anthem for disaffected youth. Movies, television, and the growing internet shaped a shared but fragmented culture. America was becoming both more connected and more fractured. And then came September 11th, 2001. On a clear Tuesday morning, hijacked planes struck the Twin Towers in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A fourth plane, Flight 93, crashed in a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were killed, the skyline of New York forever altered, and a nation shaken to its core. Smoke and ash filled the air, sirens wailed, and millions watched live on television as the towers fell. 9/11 marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Suddenly, America's triumph as the sole superpower seemed fragile. The war on terror would dominate the decades to come, reshaping foreign policy, domestic security, and the very sense of safety in everyday life. Imagine the span of those decades, from the resignation of a president to the collapse of towers. Picture gas lines in the 1970s, neon lights in the 1980s, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the boom of the 1990s internet, and the smoke over Manhattan. America had danced, stumbled, risen and fallen, all while trying to balance optimism with cynicism, progress with pain. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet, imagine the flicker of a television in a darkened living room, broadcasting Nixon's resignation, Reagan's speeches, Clinton's impeachment hearings, and finally, the stunned silence of 9/11 news coverage. The arc from Nixon to 9/11 was not smooth. It was jagged, filled with highs and lows. And yet through it all, the American story kept unfolding, restless, unfinished, and unrelenting. The 21st century arrived with fireworks and optimism, but before long, America found itself in a world more complex and more unsettled than ever. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, had torn away the illusion of safety. Now, the United States, once again, had to decide what kind of nation it would be under pressure: fearful, resolute, divided, or all at once. The immediate answer was war. In October 2001, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, targeting al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime that had harbored them. American troops trudged through mountains and deserts, chasing an enemy that slipped into caves and across borders. What began as retaliation turned into America's longest war, stretching on for 2 decades, through changing presidents, shifting strategies, and countless promises of just a little longer. Soldiers rotated in and out, some returning home with missing limbs, others with invisible wounds of trauma. Families marked holidays with empty chairs at dinner tables. In 2003, the focus shifted. The Bush administration, convinced that Saddam Hussein's Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, launched a new invasion. Shock and awe lit up Baghdad's skies as missiles thundered down. The regime collapsed quickly, but the promised weapons never appeared. Instead, chaos filled the vacuum. Insurgencies, sectarian violence, and later the rise of groups like ISIS made Iraq a quagmire. The war's toll in lives, money, and trust lingered long after the initial triumph. At home, the war on terror reshaped daily life. Airport security tightened with body scanners and endless lines. The Department of Homeland Security was created, and the Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers. For many, safety and freedom now seemed locked in a tug-of-war. Muslim Americans, immigrants, and anyone perceived as other often bore the brunt of suspicion, harassment, or worse. Yet the early 2000s weren't only about war. The decade saw dizzying technological leaps. Cell phones slimmed down, then fattened up into smartphones, putting the internet into pockets. Social media exploded first, MySpace, then Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, transforming how people connected, argued, and shared cat videos. Suddenly, anyone could broadcast to the world. It was exhilarating and overwhelming, a new digital frontier with no rules. The economy roared through the housing boom, then collapsed spectacularly in 2008. Banks had gambled with mortgages, bundling loans into towers of risk that finally toppled. When the crash came, millions lost homes, jobs, and savings. Lines at soup kitchens lengthened again, echoing the Great Depression. Anger bubbled into movements like Occupy Wall Street, with protesters camping in parks to decry the gap between the 99% and the wealthy elite. Out of the rubble, new regulations tried to cage Wall Street excess, but scars remained. Politics shifted too. In 2008, Americans elected Barack Obama the nation's first black president. His campaign of hope and change inspired millions, especially young voters. His presidency brought healthcare reform through the Affordable Care Act stimulus measures to counter the recession and symbolic milestones of progress. Yet it also revealed deep divisions. Some celebrated a more inclusive America. Others dug in with fierce opposition. The Tea Party movement rose, railing against government spending and taxes. The political climate grew hotter, louder, and less forgiving. The 2010s carried the contradictions forward. Social media became a battlefield of ideas, memes, and misinformation. Movements like Black Lives Matter emerged after police killings of unarmed Black Americans, sparking protests nationwide. Marches, chants, and hashtags carried voices that demanded racial justice, echoing the civil rights battles of the past, but amplified by smartphones and live streams. Meanwhile, cultural landscapes shifted. Same-sex marriage, once unimaginable in mainstream politics, was legalized nationwide in 2015 by the Supreme Court. Pride parades swelled with celebration, a moment of long-fought victory. Yet backlash followed too, proof that every step forward came with friction. Gender roles, immigration, climate change, all became flashpoints in a culture increasingly polarized. In 2016, Donald Trump rode a wave of populist anger, celebrity, and blunt rhetoric into the presidency. His election shocked much of the political establishment, revealing divides between rural and urban, wealthy and struggling, progressive and conservative. His presidency was loud, combative, and relentless, marked by Twitter, tirades, trade wars, immigration crackdowns, and a style that turned every day into a headline. Supporters cheered his disruption. Critics warned of threats to institutions. The volume of American politics seemed stuck at maximum. And then came 2020. A global pandemic swept the world, shutting down schools, businesses, and cities. Masks covered faces, ventilators hummed in hospitals, and Zoom meetings replaced office chatter. Millions lost loved ones. Millions more lost jobs. Grocery store shelves emptied, and toilet paper somehow became more precious than gold. Through it all, essential workers, nurses, delivery drivers, teachers carried the weight of keeping life afloat. The pandemic collided with politics. Protests after the killing of George Floyd filled streets with chants of "I can't breathe." An election held in the shadow of COVID saw record turnout, fierce debates over mail-in ballots, and tensions so high they felt combustible. The transition of power in 2021 was scarred by the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, a jarring moment when rioters carrying flags and cameras breached the halls of Congress. For many, it felt like the Civil War's ghosts had returned in new form, testing whether democracy itself could hold. And yet, even through crisis after crisis, America kept moving. Vaccines rolled out, jobs returned, debates raged, but schools reopened, stadiums filled again, and music festivals roared back to life. The 21st century has been messy, turbulent, and exhausting, but also astonishing in its speed. Technology continues to reshape lives, streaming movies, instantly sending rovers to Mars, and building AI that can write bedtime histories. High guilty as charged. Imagine the soundscape of these decades, the roar of jets over Afghanistan, the click of a mouse logging onto Facebook for the first time, the chants of protest echoing in city squares, the eerie emptiness of streets during lockdown, the hum of a vaccine fridge in a hospital, the shouts of a crowd at a political rally. The rhythm is uneven, full of jolts and contradictions, but undeniably alive. The United States entered the 21st century with swagger, was shaken by terror, tested by wars, humbled by recession, divided by politics, and scarred by a pandemic. And yet, somehow, it still argues, still rebuilds, still believes, often stubbornly, that tomorrow can be better. The United States has always been a restless republic. Born in revolution, stretched by expansion, torn by civil war, gilded in industry, tested by depression, thrust onto the world stage by 2 global wars, shadowed by nuclear fear, electrified by civil rights movements, and pushed into the digital whirlwind of the 21st century. Its story is less a straight line than a heartbeat rising and falling, pausing and surging. As we reach the present, it's tempting to ask, what have all these struggles, triumphs, and contradictions added up to? The answer, perhaps, is that America is less about a destination and more about the journey itself. A journey marked by conflict, reinvention, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow might still be different from today. Consider the constant cycles. The revolution demanded liberty, but the republic it created excluded many. The Civil War ended slavery, but Reconstruction collapsed into Jim Crow. The Gilded Age dazzled with wealth, but left millions in poverty. The Roaring Twenties sparkled with jazz, only to give way to breadlines. The Cold War made America a superpower, but also a nation on edge, ducking under desks. Each generation has faced a paradox: progress and backlash, hope and disillusion. And yet somehow, the line keeps moving forward, even if it zigzags along the way. Part of America's restlessness comes from its diversity. From the beginning, waves of immigrants reshaped the culture, bringing languages, foods, religions, and traditions. Italian immigrants stirred sauce in New York kitchens. Chinese immigrants built railroads through mountains. Mexican farm workers tilled fields in California. Refugees from war-torn lands remade lives in Midwestern towns. The nation's patchwork quilt grew brighter and sometimes more frayed with every stitch. That diversity has often fueled tension, but it has also been the wellspring of creativity. Jazz, hip-hop, baseball, Hollywood all sprang from mixtures, from collisions of difference that produced something new. Another source of restlessness lies in America's ideals. The Declaration promised equality and liberty, lofty words that have haunted every generation since. Because once you write those promises down, people will hold you to them. Abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, LGBTQ+ activists, climate protesters, all drew power from America's own words, turning them into mirrors. "Do you really mean this?" they asked. If so, then it must include us. That ongoing challenge, the tension between ideals and reality, is what keeps the Republic alive, even when it feels broken. The 21st century has only sharpened that paradox. Technology has made voices louder, connections faster, and divisions starker. Social media amplifies both hope and hate, often in the same scroll. Debates over climate change immigration inequality, and identity swirl constantly. The pandemic revealed both resilience and fragility, reminding Americans that even the most powerful nation can be humbled by something microscopic. And yet, amid the chaos, the country still dreams. It dreams in the laboratories, where scientists develop vaccines, in the classrooms, where children trace maps in the streets, where marchers chant for justice, in the quiet corners, where immigrants study English at night after long shifts. It dreams in space capsules blasting toward Mars, in the rhythm of new music, pulsing from cities, in the simple act of millions showing up to vote, even when lines are long, tempers short, and faith in institutions shaken. To be American has always meant living in contradiction, proud, yet critical, weary, yet hopeful, fractured, yet united by the act of arguing itself. Some nations seek stability. America seems addicted to turbulence. Its arguments can be bitter, even violent, but beneath them lies a strange kind of faith that voices matter, that change is possible, that the story isn't finished. History offers both warning and comfort. The nation has stumbled before through civil war, depression, corruption, and scandal. Each time the narrative of decline seemed irresistible. And yet each time the republic bent, but did not break. That resilience is not guaranteed, but it is deeply ingrained. Perhaps restlessness itself is the secret, never settling, never assuming the story is over, always demanding another chapter. So where does the story go from here? That part is unwritten. Climate change, global competition, social upheaval, technological revolutions all loom ahead. America may rise to meet them, or falter, or more likely, do both in uneven measure. But the story will continue told in the voices of those who demand to be heard, from city squares to rural farms, from classrooms to courtrooms, from protests to parades. Tonight, as you lie back in the quiet, imagine the long sweep of it all. The first footprints on this continent pressed into soft soil thousands of years ago. The thump of a printing press in Philadelphia in 1776. The crack of muskets at Gettysburg. The hum of factories in Detroit. The static of a radio announcing Pearl Harbor. The cheers as men walked on the moon. The chants of marchers across Selma's Bridge. The silence of empty streets during a pandemic. Each sound and echo layered atop the last, composing the restless rhythm of a nation still finding its way. The United States is not a finished project. It is a work in progress, sometimes sloppy, sometimes dazzling, always unfinished. That perhaps is its defining trait. A republic, restless, forever, arguing with itself, forever, reaching, forever dreaming. The United States has always been a restless republic. Born in revolution, stretched by expansion, torn by civil war, gilded in industry, tested by depression, thrust onto the world stage by two global wars, shadowed by nuclear fear, electrified by civil rights movements, and pushed into the digital whirlwind of the 21st century. Its story is less a straight line than a heartbeat rising and falling, pausing and surging. As we reach the present, it's tempting to ask, what have all these struggles, triumphs and contradictions added up to? The answer perhaps is that America is less about a destination and more about the journey itself. A journey marked by conflict reinvention and the stubborn belief that tomorrow might still be different from today. Consider the constant cycles. The revolution demanded liberty, but the republic it created excluded many. The Civil War ended slavery, but Reconstruction collapsed into Jim Crow. The Gilded Age dazzled with wealth, but left millions in poverty. The Roaring Twenties sparkled with jazz, only to give way to breadlines. The Cold War made America a superpower, but also a nation on edge ducking under desks. Each generation has faced a paradox progress and backlash, hope, and disillusion. And yet somehow, the line keeps moving forward, even if it zigzags along the way. Part of America's restlessness comes from its diversity. From the beginning, waves of immigrants reshaped the culture, bringing languages, foods, religions, and traditions. Italian immigrants stirred sauce in New York kitchens. Chinese immigrants built railroads through mountains. Mexican farm workers tilled fields in California. Refugees from war-torn lands remade lives in Midwestern towns. The nation's patchwork quilt grew brighter and sometimes more frayed with every stitch. That diversity has often fueled tension, but it has also been the wellspring of creativity. Jazz, hip-hop, baseball, Hollywood all sprang from mixtures, from collisions of difference that produced something new. Another source of restlessness lies in America's ideals. The Declaration promised equality and liberty, lofty words that have haunted every generation since. Because once you write those promises down, people will hold you to them. Abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, LGBTQ+ activists, climate protesters, all drew power from America's own words, turning them into mirrors. Do you really mean this, they asked. If so, then it must include us. That ongoing challenge, the tension between ideals and reality, is what keeps the Republic alive even when it feels broken. The 21st century has only sharpened that paradox. Technology has made voices louder, connections faster, and divisions starker. Social media amplifies both hope and hate, often in the same scroll. Debates over climate change, immigration, inequality, and identity swirl constantly. The pandemic revealed both resilience and fragility, reminding Americans that even the most powerful nation can be humbled by something microscopic. And yet, amid the chaos, the country still dreams. It dreams in the laboratories where scientists develop vaccines, in the classrooms where children trace maps in the streets, where marchers chant for justice in the quiet corners, where immigrants study English at night after long shifts. It dreams in space capsules, blasting toward Mars in the rhythm of new music, pulsing from cities in the simple act of millions showing up to vote even when lines are long, tempers short, and faith in institutions shaken. To be American has always meant living in contradiction, proud, yet critical, weary, yet hopeful, fractured, yet united by the act of arguing itself. Some nations seek stability. America seems addicted to turbulence. Its arguments can be bitter, even violent. But beneath them lies a strange kind of faith, that voices matter, that change is possible, that the story isn't finished. History offers both warning and comfort. The nation has stumbled before through Civil War, depression, corruption, and scandal. Each time the narrative of decline seemed irresistible, and yet each time the Republic bent, but did not break. That resilience is not guaranteed, but it is deeply ingrained. Perhaps restlessness itself is the secret, never settling, never assuming the story is over, always demanding another chapter. So where does the story go from here? That part is unwritten. Climate change, global competition, social upheaval, technological revolutions, all loom ahead. America may rise to meet them, or falter, or more likely, do both in uneven measure. But the story will continue, told in the voices of those who demand to be heard, from city squares to rural farms, from classrooms to courtrooms, from protests to parades. Tonight, as you lie back in the quiet, imagine the long sweep of it all. The first footprints on this continent pressed into soft soil thousands of years ago. The thump of a printing press in Philadelphia in 1776. The crack of muskets at Gettysburg. The hum of factories in Detroit. The static of a radio announcing Pearl Harbor. The cheers as men walked on the moon. the chants of marchers across Selma's Bridge, the silence of empty streets during a pandemic. Each sound and echo layered atop the last, composing the restless rhythm of a nation still finding its way. The United States is not a finished project. It is a work in progress, sometimes sloppy, sometimes dazzling, always unfinished. That perhaps is its defining trait. A republic, restless, forever, arguing with itself, forever, reaching forever, dreaming.